Hello, everyone. My name is Andy Schmidt. Welcome to this interview. I'm here with Hal Poe and David Downing. Hal, you're a professor of faith and culture at Union University. You're the author of Becoming C.S. Lewis, The Making of C.S. Lewis, The Completion of C.S. Lewis. You've written a lot about C.S. Lewis. And David Downing, the co-director of the Wade Center, which is the place that we're at. I guess maybe you should give kind of an introduction to what the Wade Center is before we even get into this conversation. Do you want to tell us about that?
This began as a collection of Lewis documents in the mid-'60s. Clyde Kilby, an English professor at Wheaton, decided that he should start collecting first editions and letters, anything he could find on C.S. Lewis. And then he decided to add Lewis's friends, Tolkien, Barfield, Williams, other influences, his friend, Dorothy Sayers, and then two of his favorite authors, George MacDonald and G.K. Chesterton. So now you have 7 British Christian authors. The collection outgrew the main library, and so a generous woman named Mary Wade gave us this building in honor of her father, Marion E. Wade. And so it's a collection of first-hand sources of our 7 authors, virtually every second-hand source, dissertations, master's theses, articles. You could easily write a book on one of our authors without ever going online here. Everything's physically present, including all of Hal's books. I'm sure if you looked in the right places, you would find a good number of Hal's books here at the Wade Center.
Yeah, and you wrote a book, Into the Wardrobe, C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia. It's been translated to what? 3, 4
Japanese, Italian, Korean, and Polish.
Yeah. Wow. So you two know a lot about C.S. Lewis, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. C.S. Lewis, the Chronicles of Narnia, the impact of children's fantasy on children and Christianity. And so I'm excited for this one because when I grew up, my dad would read me and my brothers the Chronicles of Narnia series. Some families I feel like go in the Tolkien direction with Lord of the Rings. Right. My family, we were a Chronicles of Narnia family, and so he read all the books to us, and it sparked my imagination. But I still think of my Christianity in kind of Narnian terms. I think of it to this day like that, and so I'm excited for this conversation. But the one thing I want to begin with is talking about kind of where Christian fantasy is at today in America. I feel like, from what I've seen, is that there's not a lot of Christian children's fantasy that is doing the same thing to the culture that the Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia did. I'm wondering kind of why that is, or if you guys even agree with my assessment on that. Maybe we can start with you, David. What do you think about that assessment? And then maybe we can discuss that a little bit further.
Well, I think in general, you're correct. Lewis and Tolkien, in some ways, were writing in the golden age of fantasy. Now things have expanded, but they've become very commercialized. So you immediately think, is this a property, a cinematic property? I do think there's a dearth of really good Christian fantasy now, although I'm encouraged by the Wingfeather Saga by Andrew Peterson, Peace Like a River by Leif Inger. So there's some interesting Christian fantasy out there, but I would say it's not nearly as prevalent as we wish it would be. And sometimes it's there in Christian bookstores, but it's not the quality we're looking for. So we're very privileged to have 2 of the most brilliant Oxford professors of the 20th century, both wanting to write fantasy stories. They're very high-powered people picking up this rather humble genre. They both had to defend the whole genre of children's fantasy, or fantasy in general, as legitimate art, not as just something to entertain children.
Yeah, I'm interested in your perspective.
Yes, Lewis, I think, addressed this very issue tangentially. He had a phrase that he used, latent Christianity. He said in an address to some youth ministers at the end of World War II, that what we need is not more little Christian books, but more little books on every subject by Christians with the Christianity latent. But that also includes fiction, not just works on science. Right. And in probably the last interview he did, it was the summer of 1963 for the first issue of a science fiction magazine. And one of his former students, 2 of them actually, came to his rooms in Cambridge to interview him. And he made the comment that with his science fiction, and David is the authority on the science fiction trilogy, but he said with the science fiction and Paralandra in particular, he didn't begin by thinking, how can I put the Christian story into fiction form? He began with a story, and somebody who's a committed Christian and really understands their faith, knows the scriptures, their point of view is going to come through in how they tell their story.
Right.
And that I think is the main thing going on with Lewis. He said that the story needs to take precedence. And so if your aim is to try to put Christian symbolism in a fantasy form, then you're starting off saying, what I really want to do is bore children. And, if they've got to figure out what does this symbol represent. And that wasn't the way Lewis went about it.
In fact, people thought that that's how he constructed Narnia.
Mm-hmm.
He has some good essays on the writing for children. And people said, did you take all the important Christian doctrines? Let's start with creation. We need the atonement. We need the last judgment, and reframe them in a fantasy world. Yeah. And he said that was the exact opposite of his method. He said if you start out with themes or motifs, they loom too large in the story. It becomes didactic. He said he always started with pictures. But once again, the whole cast of his mind was Christian. But he had a picture of a beautiful woman in a sleigh, and a picture of a fawn on a snowy day, and a picture of a great lion. And slowly, the images start connecting into stories, and then the story starts accruing thematic material or a worldview in the backdrop. So it's almost the exact opposite of writing didactically.
If I can even pursue this some more, because I think this is really important to your question, why aren't we seeing the same sort of thing? So many people today have in mind, I'm going to write like Lewis and Tolkien, which is to say, I'm going to imitate Lewis and Tolkien. But those stories that Lewis and Tolkien wrote came out of, it was the overflow, really, of what they were studying. I have said from time to time that The Allegory of Love is the only book C.S. Lewis ever really wrote. Everything else comes out of that. Mm-hmm. And so the Chronicles of Narnia are set in a world very much like the medieval world that Lewis was studying. And with Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings looks very much like the kind of world he was studying. And they were different worlds, separated by several hundred years. But it was what they knew. And, it's been said over and over, don't write about yourself, write about what you know. And people who are trying to imitate the Chronicles of Narnia without having spent 30 or 40 years in that world, you might have done it as a historian rather than a literary scholar, but to write about what you know. And I think a lot of people have had trouble for that reason. They are just too derivative.
Now, Lewis was aware of the effect on the reader. He said that in writing Narnia, even though he started with pictures, he said he remembered as a child that Sunday school, when Christian theology was associated with stained glass windows and overheated rooms and boring homilies. And he said, I wondered if I could get back to the basic Christian myth of the dying God who redeems the world, and sneak past those watchful dragons of childhood associations. So he was always aware that the imagination was much more receptive to ideas and pictures than the intellect might be. You mentioned the Ransom trilogy. As you're reading along the science fiction story, Ransom, the professor, gets kidnapped and taken to Mars, but gradually we start seeing that the cosmos really is medieval. There really is an archon who is in control of each planet, and they are all in worship of Mel-Eldil, the great god. And He said a lot of his readers didn't even notice that he was sneaking in all this medieval cosmology. And he wrote to a friend, it seems to me like a person of genius could smuggle any sort of theology into their fantasy stories under the guise of entertainment and transform people's imaginations. So he was always aware of kind of the subliminal power of story beyond just intellectual inquiry or intellectual argument.
He in a letter to Ruth Pitter, he said that he'd finally figured out what space travel stories are good for.
Right.
Therefore, really good for spiritual adventures. And he's not the only one who figured that out. This is Star Wars. And science fiction is having a huge, huge heyday. But notice how many science fiction stories deal with spiritual themes.
They do, right?
And just unashamedly. And the public laps it up because the public is asking these questions.
I think of the Interstellar that deals at the core. I think it was about what is like love and the relationship. Yeah, which is a spiritual type of thing too. But yeah, that's a really interesting thing. There's a book that I had just read by J.I. Packer. It's called A Quest for Godliness. And at the beginning of it, he's writing about the Puritans. And at the beginning of it, he talks about how he had gone to the redwoods in California. And as he walked through the redwoods, he felt so small in comparison to these giant trees. And he kind of explained how that should be the Christians' interaction with the Puritans, that we should feel small to these great giants. And I wonder if there's any aspect to that in the modern fantasy writer who is looking at Tolkien and Lewis as these great redwoods, and they're just walking through kind of intimidated. Do you think that has any sort of, there's an intimidation factor to this at all? I'll go to you, Hal.
I've been struck, actually, just the opposite. How many people over the last 50 years have told me that their ambition is to be the next C.S. Lewis, the next J.R.R. Tolkien. And so, if anything, it's hubris.
There you go.
And I think somebody who has the fire to write isn't thinking in terms of comparing themselves to somebody else. I mean, if you've got the fire to write, you've got a story that has to come out.
Right.
And David's published a novel, I've published a novel, and in the writing of it, you don't think, how does this stack up with Homer's Iliad?
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
You know that there are different quality of things, but you've got a story you have to tell.
Yeah.
And I think that's the most important thing, to get that story out, get it on paper.
Yeah, Lewis said, don't try to be original, just write as best you can about what you care about, and what people call originality will start being associated with your writing.
Yeah. So I want to talk about the Chronicles of Narnia and Lewis's inspiration for writing these books. You kind of touched on it a little bit, so maybe do you want to expand off that? Why Lewis decided to write a children's fantasy series?
Well, he actually got the idea when he had children come to stay with his family in Oxford during World War II. They were bombing London, so they sent about 2 million children to outside of the big cities to get away from the bombing. Wow. And he wrote one paragraph on an envelope. Both the Tolkiens and the Lewis household took in refugee children. And Lewis wrote, once there was a family that the children had to leave because of the bombing in London, and their names were Anne and Martin and Rose and Peter. And then he stopped. And for 10 years, that one paragraph just sat on the envelope. I tell people, don't throw away your drafts. You never know when you can go back and redeem that material. So he started out, he only kept Peter. And then 10 years later, he was reading his old Edith Nesbit, who was a writer from his childhood, who was very popular. And he told somebody he wanted to try a series in the spirit of Nesbit. But as I said earlier, he was also said he was dreaming of lions, and he had this image ever since he was a teenager of a fawn holding an umbrella on a snowy day with a package under his arm. I've always thought subconsciously Lewis loved classical mythology. He loved England and English weather. He said he liked their winters better than their summers. And he loved getting packages because that usually represented intellectual stimulation. In his letters, he's always writing to his father saying, please send me this book, and I just bought this great edition. So I think subliminally that the germ of Narnia was this fawn with a package on a snowy day. He was combining all the things he loved the most. A lot of it, he's evoking his own childhood. When you read The Magician's Nephew, Diggory, who becomes the professor, is obviously an autobiographical character, but his mother is dying, and he's living in the time of Sherlock Holmes and the Bastables, which is a Edith Nesbit family. So in some ways, he's writing for the children within himself. He wants to imaginally revisit his childhood in Narnia.
Yeah. And when he had that image in his mind of the fawn in the snow, that was the when he was first 16 years old. He had just gone to live with W.D. Kirkpatrick, who was going to tutor him and get him ready for the Oxford entrance exams. It was a dreadful winter, the first winter of World War I. And the snow was just in piles all over that part of England. So he's living with Kirkpatrick. Now, many people refer to Kirkpatrick as the Great Knock, because in Surprised by Joy, Lewis says, well, he was my father's headmaster, and they called him the Great Knock. Lewis and Warnie and their father did not call him the Great Knock. They called him Kirk. And so picking up on the idea of Diggory, and then go from World War I to World War II, and the children staying at the kilns, the professor in the country house that Lewis describes, I think he's describing Kirkpatrick, who he calls Kirk, Diggory Kirk. So all of this is to say that Narnia is built up of bits and pieces of memories and acquaintances and other stories and a little Bible, a little classical Greece, and the more the merrier. Yeah. And Tolkien hated it because he was a purist, and he was he wanted to keep Greek mythology over here and Norse mythology over here. But Lewis wasn't writing for scholars. He was writing for children, and children living in England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland in 1950, 1948, and who had gone through the war. And in our culture, we know Norse mythology and Greek mythology and Santa Claus, and it's all part of a child's mythology. And so Lewis was writing for children, not because of his great acquaintance with children, but because of his great memory of being a child.
And in some ways, Narnia is his imagination or his consciousness. Tolkien loved the Nordic worldview. All of his characters, dragons and wizards and elves, they all come out of Nordic mythology. And I think that's the way his imagination worked, whereas Lewis was much more syncretistic. And so, Tolkien didn't like the idea that suddenly Father Christmas shows up in Narnia. Tolkien didn't like any allusions to our world. He wanted his secondary world of imagination. He doesn't quote Shakespeare. He doesn't quote the Bible. He doesn't have classical character. He wants you to be in this sub-creation, this secondary world which doesn't make reference to our primary world. As far as I can tell, they only had one lapse when Gandalf has this big fireworks show at the beginning of the story. Tolkien says, and this one firework went zipping by like an express train. And you go, Tollers, I'm not sure. Should we have express trains in Middle Earth? I don't think so. Not even in metaphor. But other than that, he does not make the kind of references. Lewis is very comfortable talking about our primary world. He'll say, you'll see these people like workmen alongside the railroad drinking tea out of their tins in the afternoon. And first of all, I've never seen workmen by the railroad drinking their tea out of tins. But he loved the analogy. I mean, he loved to mix our world with the fictional world, the world of fantasy and imagination, whereas Tolkien really wanted to keep that secondary world separate from our world.
Yeah, and which is interesting to me because Tolkien, of course, wrote about fairy and the idea of the two worlds touching and intersecting, but he never wrote stories like that except for some of those little thin stories he wrote. Was it, Wheaton Minor?
Smith of Wheaton Major.
Smith of Wheaton Major, that's it. But Lewis, all of his are the two worlds intersecting.
Right. There's a scholar who talks about different kinds of fantasy named Farah Mendelssohn, and she says there's portal fantasies where you start out in our primary world and you go through a portal, you go through a wardrobe or a painting of a Narnian ship, and suddenly you're in Narnia. And that was very much Lewis. His theology was let's start in our real world and let's expand people's, or his strategy, expand people's imaginations into the spiritual and into the Christian. And so it's kind of natural that he writes portal fantasies. Another kind she calls immersion fantasies, where it doesn't explain how things got to be they are. You just start out in a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. So we're already in Middle Earth. Nobody's going to explain how we got there. And it's interesting that Tolkien wrote immersion fantasies. You're in Middle Earth. He doesn't have to explain why there are wizards and elves and that sort of thing. The other two were an intrusion fantasy, where something from the world of wonder and imagination breaks into our world, like King Kong or Godzilla. And one of our authors who does that the most is Charles Williams. You start out in London and suddenly you've got some kind of demonic powers or occult powers breaking into our world. And then the fourth kind in her analysis was the dream fantasy that you can't tell, is this real or am I dreaming? And the author of ours, which most fits that, is George MacDonald. You'll have a passage where you feel like you got your feet on the ground. Suddenly, sometimes I actually really do fall asleep. And then I can't remember, was that in the story I was reading or was that in my dream? So it's interesting that there are different people's strategy about how they connect our real world to the fantasy world. There's a lot of different ways to do that. And you see that among our Christian fantasy authors.
Yeah. So where did the inspiration for the wardrobe come? Because I wonder, because as a kid, every kid that I know that grew up in the church read the Chronicles of Narnia. After you read it, you're kind of like looking around the house, seeing if there's any worlds in the cabinets or anything like that. Where did that inspiration come from for Lewis?
Well, there's different versions. Go ahead, Hal.
Well, at this point, I think we have to speculate. There are a lot of different speculations that, the very idea of going inside what the wardrobe, what Lucy does, is a normal thing for children to do when they're playing hide and go seek. I mean, rainy Saturdays were wonderful in the house I grew up in. It was a 2-story house with a full attic and a full basement. Wow. And there were lots of closets. And inevitably, we would hide in the closet and pull things over us. And what Lucy's doing is what children do. And that wardrobe, which now sits about 50 feet from me here in the Wade Center, built by Lewis's grandfather, which shows up in The Magician's Nephew, and eventually the line The Witch in the Wardrobe, would just be an example of what you would use in a country where they don't have houses with closets.
Right.
A closet is a fairly recent technological invention of the United States. But over there they have wardrobes, and I have my great-grandparents' wardrobe that was in the basement when we were living in Minnesota, and my daughters were 3, 4, 5 years old at the time, and they would inevitably hide in the wardrobe. But it had nothing to do with Narnia.
It's just a good hiding spot.
It's a convenient hiding place. Yeah.
Right. Wow.
This wardrobe we have here at the Wade Center is an heirloom, as Hal said, handmade by Lewis's grandfather. And one of their cousins, Claire Clapperton Lewis, remembers the little boys climbing into the wardrobe and do storytelling. Kind of like you go in a closet and tell each other stories. And so it looks like he associated that wardrobe as a portal to imagination and storytelling.
Yeah.
They must have been pretty small, because I don't think you want two boys very tall inside that wardrobe. A few weeks ago, I had a second grade boy. People always want to reach the back and touch the back of the wardrobe to see if it leads to Narnia. We're going to have a trap door so it leads to Bookshopia. They fall through, and then there they are right in front of the cash register. But this little boy was reaching the back, and he actually had 1 foot off the ground. And I said, be careful. I came on a second grade tour just like you about a month ago, and I fell in, and I came out looking like this because time is different in Narnia. And his teachers all laughed, and he was terrified. He almost ran out to the parking lot.
That's
but it is a great, it's a big backstory for a portal to know that he actually got inside and told stories as a child.
Yeah, the portal thing is really interesting, because there's the way that I always kind of viewed it as a kid was that there's this connection between the spiritual world and the real world, but you in a way, Lucy found it without even really looking for it. And I wonder if there's any, I guess, is there any connection from her not necessarily searching for Narnia but coming to find it, to a Christian, I don't know, maybe running into Christ in a way that seems, or running into the Christian world in a way that is unexpected. I don't know if I'm drawing too much of a connection that isn't there, but is there anything have you guys come across anything on that?
Well, I think it's fitting that she finds Narnia first, because she's the most spiritually sensitive of all the 4 children.
Yeah, right.
In the sequel, Prince Caspian, she's the first one to see Aslan.
Yeah.
And the others don't. There's this principle in Narnia that not seeing is believing, but believing is seeing. So I don't know if he worked this out in advance, but I think he does see her as the most sensitive to other worlds. And so it makes sense that she would be the first one to go to Narnia.
And unplanned in that sense, goodness, the very idea of a personal testimony is the idea that everybody's story is different. In fact, Aslan talks about that. Is it in...
Look at the horse and his boy.
That. I was thinking, was it with I don't remember. I don't remember which one.
The girl and the horse and his boy, they kind of talk about how those two stories collide, and that he was there in both.
Yeah, and I think he talks with Jill about it, doesn't he? That everyone has their own story. This is not your story. This is someone else's story.
Right. He got part of that from the Bible. He really liked a passage where somebody said, "Is it true that John is going to live forever?"
Yeah.
And Jesus says, pretty much, "What is that to you?"
Yeah.
Go with and the idea that we don't get to know other people's stories. We also don't get to know what would have happened. So Lewis likes us to be grounded in who we are and our story, rather than speculating too much about other people. That is a wonderful scene in Horse and His Boy, where he's abandoned at sea. He's found by a fisherman who doesn't love him. He tries to escape. He's on horseback and he's chased by lions. And it's the interesting Narnia Chronicle, because the spiritual element doesn't come until very late in the story. And Aslan says, "Well, tell me your sorrows." And Shasta says, "Well, I was abandoned at sea. I was found by a fisherman who didn't love me, treated me like a slave. I tried to escape to Narnia. I was chased by lions. At one point, I was stuck in the tombs outside of Tashbaan." And then Aslan says, well, I was actually the cat that protected you from the jackals at Tajban, and I was the lion that chased your horse because you were on the wrong road. And I was actually the one that made sure that your boat got to shore. So there's this kind of feeling of providence in retrospect, which I think this is what Lewis does. He takes an important spiritual truth, but he puts it in a very concrete situation involving children. And you find out much later that there were providences in your life that you never imagined at the time.
And that's exactly how he tells his own story in Surprised by Joy.
Right.
Only he does it as a game of chess.
Right.
And that God is always moving, and he didn't really recognize it until checkmate.
Right. There are scholars who've tried to work out the stages of a chess game in Surprised by Joy. They think he's actually talking about a real chess match, but I'm not convinced.
It is that aspect, that dynamic in Narnia, where you find out later that Aslan had his hands all like he was moving things along in a way that nobody really recognized. It is it's like a humbling thing to think about as a Christian, as a kid, that you're wherever you end up, it's not necessarily because you got yourself there in a way, like God was working in this whole thing. It's just really interesting. It was something that I had just finished reading, The Horse and His Boy, and that was probably the one book out of all 7 of them growing up that I least cared about. And now I read it now as a 24-year-old. I'm like, got to that point where he's explaining, as I was explaining, I was there when you were a child, and I got your boat safely ashore, and I was like, wow, that's really impactful. There's so much depth to that. So super cool. So he starts with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. That's the first one that he writes. You want to break down how he started to expand? Because did he have plans the whole time? I want to turn this into a full series, or was it this is a kind of a one-off thing? And then how did that all go?
I'll let you take that one.
I've been thinking about this the last few years because I had to write about it in the biography. He had the idea of this initial story, and it was a one-off. He had one story.
Okay.
And so he was going to publish that story. While he was writing it, he had the idea for a second story, which is The Magician's Nephew. Started it. It went nowhere. He dropped it because he got an idea for a third story, which was Prince Caspian. And that's it. Only then he got an idea for another story. So he did not envision a 7-volume series of stories about Narnia, but in the end he wound up with 7 volumes. So, and he wrote about that in a letter to a little girl explaining how they all came about and what he had planned. And an illustration of that is the fact that the series is not the Chronicles of Narnia. If you look at the first editions of all 7 volumes in the United States and in the UK, you've got different things like the Narnia Adventures, and different things. But Lewis didn't name them the Chronicles of Narnia. That came afterwards as a marketing device, and I know a little bit about that because I had not planned to write a 3-volume biography of Lewis. I was just writing a 1-volume account of his teenage years, not even his whole childhood, just his teenage years. And then that went well, and so one thing led to another. But as a result, the 3-volume set doesn't have a name. And so the 7-volume series did not have a name. Roger Lancelin Green, Lewis's great friend in the 50s, and his encourager in the Narnia stories, a former student, suggested the title, The Chronicles of Narnia.
Wow.
So we need to come up with a name. Like we start calling these the Lewis Saga. What do you want?
The publisher Crossway is calling it Becoming C.S. Lewis. So
The whole
naming the
series.
series for the first volume.
Oh, really?
But yeah, and
That's
it's
a good- I like
it's okay. So that would be one reason why they are not in the Lewis Chronicles are not in chronological order.
Yeah. No,
They're
that makes
in
sense.
the order in which he came up with the ideas.
Yeah.
So my feeling is he was strongly thinking trilogy, because at the end of Voyage of the Dawn Treader, the Christianity gets very explicit. The lion becomes a lamb, and he's cooking breakfast on the shoreline
There's your
like Jesus
John
did.
chapter
Exactly.
21 again.
Exactly. So I have a feeling, and then Lucy says, "Well, it's not Narnia. It's you, Aslan. We don't want to leave you." And Aslan says, "Well, I'm in your world by another name. You can look for me in your own world."
Yeah.
That's very explicitly Christian, and this is not pure fantasy. There's actually spiritual realities here, which you'll find in your own world. But I think later on, he realized that wasn't going to be the wrap-up story. Yeah. A little girl wrote to him and says, "Well, what's Aslan's name in our world?" And rather than just saying, "Well, I was going for Jesus Christ," he says, "Well, who can you think of in your world that came about Christmas time and died for someone else's fault?" And then, and he lays out all these clues, but he never tells her. He wants her to think about who might be the Aslan of our world.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, as I think through all 7 books, there's a lot of different themes and stories. And this is a big question, so you guys can take it in whatever direction you want. But what do you see as some of the bigger themes across all 7 books? Obviously, they're written in kind of this weird order, so I don't know if he even had in mind a larger, grander theme. But what are some? Are there any, and if there are, what are they?
David's actually written a book about this.
And how would you describe that?
Great book.
Thank you. Well, it is hard to talk about overarching themes. Part of it is the sovereignty of Aslan over everything that happens.
Yeah.
But a lot of it has to do with moral psychology. He doesn't just have stick characters like the Hardy Boys. They each have their own personality, and they each have spiritual challenges for their temperament and their place in life. So there's a lot more moral psychology than one might expect from a children's story. Someone wrote and said, "How can they seem older in Narnia?" And Lewis said, "Well, youth and age only touch the surface of our lives. When I was 12, parts of me were 50, and now that I'm 50, parts of me are still 12. Wow. And so there's something about using child psychology or the behavior of children to teach the way we all are in the world.
Yeah.
When I first read that as a college student, that quote, I said, wow, he's 50 and he's still remembering childhood. And now, of course, 50 seems pretty young to me, but I know exactly what he means now as you get older.
Yeah. Do you have anything on the themes?
Well, yes, just the character who continues to appear. Children come and go, but the character who continues to appear is Aslan. And there's been a tendency since the 1950s to think of, in the United States, to think of Christianity almost exclusively in terms of the death of Jesus. And we'll sort of tag on the resurrection once a year at Easter time, but otherwise it's just the death of Jesus. But Lewis was, with his emphasis on mere Christianity and the ancient creeds of the church, what is it that we believe? And how is God, in fact, active in our lives? He'd been wrestling with philosophers of science the previous decade over the idea of God actually being involved in a universe that is also governed by physical laws. And how's that possible? So it's not just that Christ died for us, but the ever-present reality of Christ in the world, and so you've got different aspects of Christianity in different ones of the books. Some after the biblical period, like apostasy and Reformation. He talks about that sort of thing. We would say spiritual awakening, revivals, that sort of thing. So it's a thoroughly Christian story without being systematic theology.
Yeah.
And it is more pastoral theology than philosophical theology. It's the story and his concept of the faith being a great story.
It is interesting that he spends the first two books getting to the death and resurrection of Aslan, but then the rest of the series is after that. And like Aslan comes to life, and then you have all of the rest of what happens in Narnia. Whereas a lot of Christian, like I can think what you were trying kind of saying earlier was a lot of Christians are focusing primarily on the death and resurrection of Christ, which is great. There's nothing wrong with that.
So you've got major doctrines, the atonement in the first book, creation in The Magician's Nephew, the second coming and last judgment in the final battle.
But Lewis he took these Christian doctrines, but he kind of Lewisified them.
Exactly.
And so you got an imaginative supposal. He didn't like the word allegory. Yeah. You mentioned the last battle. Now, traditionally, judgment, you have the sheep and the goats, or you have those who are condemned and those who are redeemed. The way Lewis frames it, they're all coming before Aslan at the end of the story. They're in the new Narnia. And those who look into his face with love and affection, they go one direction. And those who confront him with a sense of horror and estrangement go in another direction. And theologically, he's implying it's kind of the opposite of Calvinism. The day of judgment is really a day of acknowledging who you are and your relationship to God. Yeah. And so he sneaks in some of Lewisian theology into these Narnian stories.
Yeah, the Last Judgment is not a trial.
Right.
And so they're following the path they've laid out.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
In The Great Divorce, Lewis has George MacDonald say, in the end, there are two kinds of people, those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, well, thy will be done. So he always stressed the importance of personal choice and the reality of free will over some sort of predestination scheme.
Well, then I gotta ask, because I think this kind of ties into what you're saying. Susan, the kind of that why? Okay, so who is Susan, or maybe what is Susan inspired from? So what inspired that character? Because Susan is a very logical, very reasonable character who ends up falling away from the belief of Narnia and then gets focused in on the things of the world, beauty and whatnot. I guess what inspired that?
She's someone we've all met.
Yeah.
I mean, in the United States, you graduate from high school and you graduate from church.
Yeah, right.
You don't have to look very far for Susan.
I think you could argue that all four of the Pevensey children are aspects of Lewis. Once again, we don't want to get allegorical. If you read the Brothers Karamazov, the three brothers are clearly three aspects of Dostoevsky himself, the spiritual and the sensual and the intellectual. And I think you could argue that Peter is Lewis trying to be the best he can, whereas Edmund is that selfish, self-centered, spiteful side.
Lewis as he is.
Yeah. And Lucy is the spiritual sensitivity. She really loves and seeks him out. She sees him first. Whereas he saw Susan as partly entering into that early adolescence. And people make a big deal out of she liked lipstick, but he criticizes himself in Surprised by Joy in his what we would call junior high years, early teens. He said, I became a fop and a cad and a snob. And that doesn't involve lipstick and it doesn't involve women. It's just a stage of life that you just become shallow for a while until you learn to reconnect with your childhood. So I think she's that side of us all that wants to be cool. I read an article yesterday about little girls wanting to wear fingernail polish, and they get these creams they see on TV for exfoliating your skin, and they're 8 years old. So I think she represents that kind of side of person who's seduced by the world and worldly glamour.
Yeah, a 4-year-old plays make-believe in a certain way. A 16-year-old plays make-believe, as does a 24-year-old, all in different ways.
When I came across that as a kid, I remember just being shocked. I was so sad that not everybody was going to make it. Not everybody
Right.
was going to enter Aslan's Land. I still, I mean, as a kid, it felt like I got hit by a train when I.
Yeah,
when I
well,
heard
that's the counterbalance to any charge of universalism with
Yeah.
Lewis.
Right.
Yeah, it is. That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. So I know we talked about Diggory, and I had read, and this might be wrong, that Diggory's character was inspired by Tolkien. Is there any truth to that?
People say that about Ransom and the Ransom trilogy. Diggory, no, because in The Magician's Nephew, he's so much like Lewis. His mother's dying. He says, "I'm living in the time of Sherlock Holmes." And even Uncle Andrew, I think, may be an image of this schoolmaster, Robert Capron, that Lewis felt traumatized by. Robert Capron was about 60 and he had a mop of white hair and he had a strange, waxy looking nose. And when you get to Uncle Andrew, we turn this scary figure into a buffoon. So I think Diggory is Lewis remembering his own childhood. I think that's a safer way to go than Tolkien.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. So I kind of want to talk about how these books relate to what was a cultural effect of these books. So let's start maybe with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. When that came out, was it a huge boom? Did everybody kind of love that book, or what was the cultural effect that it had right away? I'm not even sure I've ever looked into that.
Yeah, not a big boom. It wasn't a phenomenon like Harry Potter.
Yeah. Okay.
It's been a growing classic. Next year will be the 75th anniversary at our Inklings Weekend, Oxford. That's what we're going to focus on. And the idea that a children's book is still in print after 75 years, that makes it a classic, solid. It's something children read. You want to be sure your children read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's like The Little Train That Could. It's like Peter Rabbit, Winnie the Pooh. There are some great classics. There are scads of books published every year, but very few survivors. And so it's had staying power.
Yeah, the Oxford History of Children's Literature called the Narnia Chronicles the most sustained creative achievement in children's literature of the 20th century. So that's very high praise, 60 years after. Let's see, Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe came out in 50, so we're coming up on 75.
75.
Good arithmetic.
Yeah. I can do 75. I'd have trouble with 73 or 67, but 75 I can do.
We can do round numbers.
Cool. So what do you think it was about the Chronicles of Narnia series? We've talked a lot about why it was so great, but what do you think it was that makes it this timeless classic that even non-Christians are wanting to read through this?
Yeah, and it's again getting back to that interview Lewis had with his former students. It's all the story. I mean, it's just a great story.
Yeah,
and
it's also
there's some things about it that identify with that generation because it's during the war. In 1950, the British were still in austerity. They were still rationing food in 1950, and the memories of the air raids and all of that. It hit a nerve. So there's this air of realism that anchors the fantasy, and the witch is vanquished, just like Hitler.
Yeah.
I think another appeal of both Lewis and Tolkien is they know how to portray good characters. A lot of times we have, especially when I was growing up, most fiction had to do with anti-heroes and disillusionment. And you had all these dissection of evil characters, but you really had trouble saying, well, what does a good character look like? And just following the luminous personality of Aslan, his wisdom of balancing between love and justice, and his ability to bring people along in their relationship with him, their understanding of him. And when you go to Tolkien, you have, here's what a good wizard looks like. Here's what a good ranger looks like. And even Frodo, he's always trying to do the right thing. And I think it's refreshing for people to get a three-dimensional portrait of good people rather than always dissecting people's follies and foibles and their dark side.
Yeah.
No, that's interesting. I got a couple more questions. I want to talk a little bit about fantasy, Christian children's fantasy at large. Like, I want to know do you guys think that it's important for Christians to continue to engage in endeavors like children's fantasy, like Chronicles of Narnia, to continue to try to create new stories like that? And if so, why? So maybe start with you, Hal.
I think it was Learning in Wartime, a sermon Lewis preached at the beginning of World War II. He says something to the effect that we need to learn good philosophy, otherwise we'll have bad philosophy. Because everybody has philosophy, whether it's thought about or just assumed. And the same is true with the imagination. A Christian fantasy helps a child train their imagination while not being aware that their imagination is being trained, because everyone has imagination and everyone fantasizes about themselves and the world in which we live. How the imagination works was a huge concern of Lewis. But I think it's children, like people of all ages, humans need stories. I think God created us in such a way that stories are critical to who we are. And when you think about, the Exodus, the commandment was tell the story every year, repeat the story, tell the story of why this night is different. And so stories in general are critical, but I think the fantasy story, especially so for children, to give a sense of proper understanding of the world and right and wrong, and it's a training ground.
Right. Lewis said when he read George MacDonald's Phantastes that it baptized his imagination. He wasn't ready intellectually to become a Christian, but as a teenager, there was this kind of imaginative allure to a world with wonder and awe and with spiritual realities. So I think it's important that we continue to baptize the imagination of young people. There's two basic kinds of imagination. One is believing in dragons, which is kind of an aesthetic imagination. Wouldn't it be exciting to have adventures with dragons? Although both Lewis and Tolkien said, I'm glad they didn't actually show up in England. Let's keep them in the world of fantasy. But then you have another doctrine or another belief like angels, and there's actually a spiritual imagination, which is of things unseen but real. And I think Lewis is constantly trying to start out by stirring your aesthetic imagination, but eventually trying to enlarge your spiritual imagination. You put down the book and you say, I wonder if there are spiritual realities beyond what I can see. He says when he read other fantasies besides George MacDonald, he closed the book and kind of the dim reality set in again. I'm just sitting at a table reading a book. But he said, when I read George MacDonald, a bright shadow came out of the page into the real world. And Lewis likes to do that for us. He likes us to think about Eldils in Out of the Silent Planet. They're these footsteps of light and this dance of sunlight. And you can always sort of sense their presence, but you can't ever look at them. And after you read the Ransom trilogy, you're walking some night in the woods in the moonlight, and you start going, am I surrounded by angels? It sort of quickens your sense that spiritualities may be just to your elbow. And both Lewis and Tolkien, I think, have that ability.
Yeah. Well, and one other thing that both Lewis and Tolkien had is, I think they both engage in this relationship between the intellectualism and the creative mind, the imagination. And I think it's I don't know. Maybe you guys haven't seen this as much as I have, but I've seen in my lifetime that it feels like people like to put those in their two different categories. You have the intellectuals over here and the creatives over here, and they don't often cross paths. And and Lewis and Tolkien and guys like Chesterton, they were the combination of both of those things. I don't. I mean, do you think that's important for people who are storytellers and creatives, and people who are intellectuals in the universities to kind of start to cross paths with each other and have those sorts of discussions? And I mean, do you think that that's important?
I mentioned the allegory of love earlier. His first great critical scholarly work, a study of medieval allegorical courtly love poetry. But in it, one of the things that he's really fascinated and consumed by, and you see him talking about it throughout the book, is the idea of being a whole person, to be whole. And in that book, he talks about the head, the chest, and the loins. Well, he brings that same idea back in The Abolition of Man. And it's the idea that the intellect, the emotions, the character, the imagination, the will are all at play. And you can pretend like they're not. But no one has a more vivid imagination than a burglar, because they have to imagine how to get into the house. And nobody has a more vivid imagination than someone like Albert Einstein, whose pure intellect, only all of his work depended upon imagination. So, yes, I think it's critical that we practice the biblical idea of being a whole person.
In his memoir, Surprised by Joy, Lewis says that the two hemispheres of his mind were completely divided, intellect and imagination. And he said, everything that I loved and thought was wonderful and alluring was actually fiction. But what I thought to be the real world was grim and meaningless. And so that divided mind was a part of his existential problem throughout his teens and his 20s. Now, when he came across the idea that myth might become fact, that the death of Balder and Osiris and other characters, that might actually have happened in history. Jesus came to a real historical place and time and did indeed die and was resurrected. He suddenly said, all these myths are intuitions of the need for redemption, and God's preparing the human imagination for this to actually happen in real history. So for him, that was a huge breakthrough, not only in terms of his faith, but also of reintegrating his mind. Suddenly, everything he loved was a kind of suggestion of spiritual realities. So, no, I agree. I think what for him was a huge breakthrough, the reconnecting or reintegrating of his intellect and his imagination should be a very essential priority for all of us.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
And he was conscious of it. He was self-conscious that this was happening and that it had been a problem.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so final question, probably going to be the hardest question of this whole thing, but what is your favorite Chronicles of Narnia book and why? And you have to pick one. I don't want to hear the whole like it's picking your kids or whatever type thing. So we'll start with, I guess I'll give you guys a second to think, and then whoever has theirs can begin.
I think The Magician's Nephew, for contrarian reasons, because The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the favorite of so many, and it's the one I always think about. So for contrary reasons, I go to The Magician's Nephew because it begins with a real problem that so many people have. Why is there suffering in the world? And it's not a philosophical question. It's why is my mother dying?
Yeah.
And then it gives you a real stem winder of a journey from then on, where he's dealing with Einstein's physics and multiverses and all sorts of other matters other than just fabulous storytelling. So it's got a lot of punch to it.
I'll say that I do love that book, and I just read it about 6 months ago, and there's a point at the end where Diggory is explaining what's happening with his mom to Aslan. And he kind of looks up, and Aslan's tears are bigger than his. Yeah. And I just started crying because I never even,
that's
wow,
powerful.
It's just amazing.
The other things that happen in it, obviously it reflects a biblical idea of the judgment of a world, but also the creation of a world. But also you've got this flying horse, that's Greek mythology, Pegasus. And you've got the garden with the tree that has healing properties. Well, is it the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, or is it the Garden of the Hesperides?
Right.
That he talks about so often, and it's both, and it's all of this coming together. So mixing it up, and whereas a lot of times he gravitates towards Plato in the Silver Chair. With the creation, he's using Aristotle's understanding of full-blown types, popping out of the ground, and that's Aristotle. It's not in the Book of Genesis, but it's Aristotle.
But he is very syncretistic or synthetic, because the animals bubbling out of the ground is from Milton. That happens in Paradise Lost. So, excuse me, I would also want to bring up the silver chair. You mentioned it briefly, but everybody thinks so much of Aslan as Christ in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. And Lewis I said, no, it's not allegory. It's a supposal. And when you get to the silver chair, you see what he means, because now Aslan is much more like God the Father giving the law. At the beginning, the children have to learn the 4 signs. Remember the signs, repeat them in the morning. It's almost a paraphrase of Deuteronomy about remember the law and quote it to your children. But he says, well, the signs are very clear up here in Aslan's country, but when you get down to Narnia, it's going to be much more unclear. So keep repeating the signs. And so I love the supposal that the signs to find the lost prince are being conflated with the 10 commandments. These are the guidelines we need to have our lives flourish. And then I love that passage you mentioned, Plato, where they're underground and the witch tries to convince them or hypnotize them that Narnia is not real, the sun's not real, Aslan's not real. And it's kind of you could call it a critique of Freud's theory of projection, that we all have inadequate fathers, but what if there was a perfect father in the sky that took care of us? Freud was kind of contradictory, because he also had a paradigm of hating your father and wanting to kill your father. So you kind of go, which is it? The eternal father, who's a projection of our fathers. But in any case, there's this wonderful reply by Puddleglum, the marsh wiggle, and he sticks his foot in the fire, which helps clear your mind from the spell, the magic spell. And he says, even if there is no sun, I still want to believe in the beauty of Narnia. Even if there is no Aslan, I still want, and it's almost Pascal's wager in the mouth of a fantasy character. Wouldn't it be better to live a life of belief and feel fulfilled and feel like you have meaning and purpose and be wrong than spend your whole life in a life of unbelief and lacking in purpose? And then what if you discover that you're wrong? There is an afterlife. So I love how he's able to take pretty sophisticated philosophical concepts and to clothe them believably in the mouths of fantasy characters.
Yeah, wow. What's happening, and I'll be done after this, I just thought of this. What's happening when Jill and Eustace are being blown, like they're being blown into Narnia. What is that? Like they're sitting on the...
There are 4 images for the Holy Spirit in the Old Testament. The first one we find in the book of Genesis, the very word that we translate spirit, is the Hebrew word ruach, which means spirit or breath or wind. And so I think that's what he's getting at, that by the breath, the wind, the spirit, they're being transported. It's Philip being transported or moved by the Holy Spirit to go down to Gaza in the book of Acts, led by the Spirit, pushed by the Spirit. That's a possibility.
I'm sorry.
No, there's just
I would definitely agree with that. There's a great scene in The Horse and His Boy where Shasta says, "Who are you?" And he gets 3 answers that say, "I am," in I can't remember the exact wording, but a very authoritative, sovereign voice. And then "I am" in this kind of loving, redemptive voice, and then I am in kind of a whisper. So even in this little incident, he's going to go ahead and remind us of the Trinity, the three persons of the Trinity.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. I mean, we'll end it now. I could keep asking questions about Narnia. It's so amazing, but I do appreciate you guys taking time to do this and to talk about C.S. Lewis and Narnia and the importance of fantasy. I think it's, I've loved talking to you guys, even for the short amount of time that we have talked today. So you have your book, what's it called again? Into the Wardrobe.
Into the Wardrobe in English. The Polish translation I couldn't read, and I met a Polish gentleman who looked at it and said, "Why does it say exploring the cabinet?" And I said, "No, it's into the wardrobe." He says, "Well, that's not what it means in Polish." Right. So Into the Wardrobe is the title in English.
People are like, what does this have to do with Narnia?
Exactly, they do.
Oh, man. Okay, and then you've written a bunch, your C.S. Lewis books, what are they all called?
The Becoming C.S. Lewis, The Making of C.S. Lewis, and The Completion of C.S. Lewis.
Yes.
The biography.
Awesome. So people should check those out, right?
One of my favorite books by Hal is a book on the Inklings, illustrated with beautiful color photographs of Oxford and other places. But he wrote the text, and it's very insightful and readable text, just to give an overview of that whole group.
Yeah. Wow.
Good job, Hal.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Cool.
And while we're plugging one another's books, The Most Reluctant Convert is David's book about Lewis's conversion, which is excellent.
I was doing a radio interview, and they said, "This is David Downing, the author of The Most Reluctant Convict." I said, "I'm going to go with that. That'll probably sell more books, you know."
Right.
The jailhouse years of C.S. Lewis.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. I didn't know how long you guys were going to go back and forth on that. I thought you were going to say, "Oh, well, you have to read Hal's." Anyways,
we can do it all after.
Turn this into a mutual admiration society.
Yeah, part 2 of this podcast is just back and forth. Anyway, thanks for doing this, guys, and thank you to all of you who are listening. Make sure you like, subscribe, share this with your friends, leave us a 5-star rating, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.